Between 2024 and 2026, the Women's National Basketball Association entered one of the most consequential and turbulent periods in its history. Revenue climbed, viewership records fell, and franchise valuations reached figures the league had never seen. Yet alongside those gains, a set of structural problems, long present but previously muted, came into sharp relief. What emerged was not a simple story of success, but a more complicated picture of a league under pressure from forces it had not fully prepared to manage. The financial transformation was real and measurable. Following the 2024 season, estimates placed the league's total value at a minimum of $875 million, with projections exceeding $1 billion by 2026. Much of that appreciation was tied directly to the 2024 rookie class, and in particular to Caitlin Clark, whose presence in her debut season was credited with generating more than 25% of the league's total revenue, encompassing attendance, television rights, and merchandise sales. Average viewership rose from 462,000 in 2023 to over 1.3 million by 2025, a 185% increase. Merchandise sales climbed 236% year-over-year. For the Indiana Fever specifically, the average ticket price went from $60 to $140 within a single season. Those numbers, however compelling, concealed a more precarious situation. The WNBA had recorded a loss of approximately $40 million in the fiscal year immediately preceding the 2024 boom. Critics and industry analysts pointed to this as evidence that the league's newfound valuation was not the product of broad-based demand, but rather the concentrated draw of a handful of individual players. The NBA, which has long subsidized WNBA operations, remained the financial backstop that prevented market forces from fully exposing the league's operational deficits. In this context, the surge in franchise valuations looked less like organic growth and more like a speculative correction driven by name recognition, rather than sustainable revenue architecture. The ticket market illustrated this tension most visibly. For most of its existence, the WNBA had operated as an affordable option for sports fans, with average ticket prices in the $20 to $40 range. The 2024 season dismantled that positioning entirely. Indiana Fever home games saw a 180% spike in web traffic, and secondary market prices reached levels previously unassociated with women's professional basketball. The get-in price for the Fever's 2024 home opener against the New York Liberty reached $487 on resale platforms. For comparison, a concurrent matchup between the Washington Mystics and the New York Liberty had tickets available for as low as $35, while fans hoping to see Clark play in Connecticut faced minimum prices between $99 and $161, with floor-side seats reaching as high as $4,000. The demographic consequences were measurable. The average Fever fan attending games traveled 314 miles in 2024, up from 237 miles the previous year. That shift reflected a market transformation. Local fans, many of whom had followed the league through its leaner years, were being priced out. In their place came regional visitors and higher-income fans willing to pay premium prices for a specific experience. Among long-standing supporters, the response was not enthusiasm but frustration, a sense of displacement from a league they had sustained during periods when it attracted little commercial attention. That frustration intensified in 2025, when Caitlin Clark was sidelined by a series of soft tissue injuries that limited her to 13 games. The effect on the secondary ticket market was immediate and severe. Road games that had commanded significant premiums the year before saw get-in prices fall by as much as 71% when Clark was unavailable. A Fever matchup against the Washington Mystics dropped from $41 to $22. A game at the United Center against the Chicago Sky fell from $86 to $25. The magnitude of those declines confirmed what analysts had begun to argue. The WNBA's growth was not a league-wide phenomenon, but a concentration of interest around a single player. When she was absent, ticket demand reverted toward historical baselines, or below them, as fans who had attended specifically for Clark's presence saw little reason to pay elevated prices for the broader product. The injury itself raised additional concerns about how the Fever organization managed its marquee asset. Clark's 2025 season began with a quad issue during training camp that developed into a series of cascading setbacks. A right groin injury sustained in mid-July ultimately ended her season. A secondary injury, A left ankle bone bruise occurred in early August while she was still in the rehabilitation process, preventing her from reaching the speed necessary to test the recovery of her groin. Throughout this period, the Fever front office was criticized for providing limited and inconsistent information about her status, leaving fans and analysts without reliable guidance for weeks. When the decision to end her season was announced in September 2025, it was framed as a collective choice prioritizing long-term health. Critics questioned why the determination had not come earlier, and some suggested the ambiguity was maintained deliberately to preserve ticket sales and viewer interest during the interim. Clark herself acknowledged the difficulty of the experience. Having not missed a game in 4 years of college basketball, she described the period as deeply isolating. The organization subsequently committed to a more individualized approach to managing her workload in 2026, including a personalized conditioning routine designed to reduce soft tissue injury risk. Parallel to the injury narrative, significant criticism was directed at the Fever's coaching and roster management. The tenure of head coach Christy Sides through 2025 generated sustained public dissatisfaction, particularly during the early portion of the 2024 season when the Fever began 1-7. A frequently cited incident occurred in May 2024 during a game against the Los Angeles Sparks. Sides removed Clark from the game with nearly 5 minutes remaining in the third quarter while Indiana held a lead. During the approximately 4 minutes Clark was on the bench, the Sparks went on an 11-0 run, converting a 7-point Fever advantage into a 4-point deficit. The Fever lost the game. The decision was described in public forums as a fundamental failure of in-game management, with critics arguing that the coaching staff prioritized rotation schedules over competitive outcomes or player momentum. The organization moved on from Sides in late 2025, but the episode remained a touchstone in broader discussions about the Fever's leadership and its ability to maximize the asset it had in Clark. The roster itself drew criticism on structural grounds. Clark's college career had been built around a system emphasizing high-tempo play, deep shooting, and elite passing within a positionless framework. The Fever's existing core centered on Aaliyah Boston, a player whose strengths, physical play in the post, deliberate pace did not naturally align with Clark's style. Early attempts to adapt Boston's game to a faster, more perimeter-oriented system created difficulties for both players. The lack of on-court synergy contributed to a perception that the organization had not adequately considered how to build a roster around its primary asset. Chemistry between the two players improved as the season progressed and under subsequent leadership, but the early struggles had already shaped a negative public narrative about the franchise's competence. The officiating environment drew sustained and pointed criticism throughout the 2024 to 2026 period, and it became one of the more divisive topics in public discourse about the league. Critics argued that physical play directed at high-profile players was not being adequately penalized, and that officials were structurally under-equipped to manage a game that had grown faster and more physical than at any prior point in the league's history. WNBA officials are contractors paid on a per-game basis, a contrast to the full-time salaried status of NBA referees. That resource gap, analysts argued, resulted in an officiating core that was insufficiently prepared for the demands of a more athletic product. The 2025 matchup between the Indiana Fever and the Connecticut Sun illustrated the officiating concerns. The game produced 5 technical fouls, 3 ejections, and 2 flagrant fouls. One incident involving Clark, a defender swiping at her face, followed by a body check after the whistle, was initially penalized with only a technical foul. Following widespread public criticism, the call was retroactively upgraded to a flagrant 2 foul. Critics argued the episode reflected not an isolated error but a systemic pattern. The league's most commercially significant players were not receiving the protection that would signal to fans a baseline standard of safety and fairness on the court. The perception of inconsistent officiating, combined with the broader frustrations around ticket pricing and roster management, contributed to a deteriorating sense of trust between the league and portions of its fan base. The financial structure of player compensation also shifted significantly during this period, and not without controversy. The introduction of the exceptional performance on initial contract provision created conditions in which players early in their careers could command salaries that exceeded those of established veterans. The most prominent example was Aaliyah Boston's 4-year, $6.3 million contract extension with the Fever, the largest total contract in WNBA history at that time, surpassing the $5 million deal signed by A'ja Wilson, the league's reigning MVP and champion. While Wilson's average annual value remained marginally higher, the total contract figure for Boston generated significant criticism. The highest-paid player in the WNBA as recently as 2025 had earned approximately $250,000. The perception that certain players had received dramatically larger contracts than the players widely considered most accomplished created resentment both within the league and among fans who viewed the compensation structure as inconsistent with on-court merit. The sociological dynamics within the fan base added another layer of complexity to the league's situation. The rapid influx of new fans, many drawn by Clark's visibility and the cultural attention surrounding her, introduced significant friction with the league's existing audience. Long-standing supporters, many of whom had followed the WNBA through years of minimal commercial interest, reported feeling displaced not only in the physical spaces of arenas, but in the digital communities, where the league had historically maintained strong engagement. The tension centered on accusations from some in the existing fan base that newer fans were not primarily interested in the sport itself, but were using individual players as proxies for broader cultural or ideological positions. Terms and narratives that gained circulation during this period deepened existing divisions rather than broadening a shared sense of community. The result was a digital environment described by many veteran fans as increasingly hostile, affecting their engagement with the league regardless of what was happening on the court. This sociological friction was not merely anecdotal. It intersected with concrete grievances about ticket access and officiating to produce a movement among some fans toward disengagement or boycott. Critics argued that the league's response to this environment, which included fining players for public criticism and limiting candid communication, prioritized image management over honest accountability. For fans who had remained invested through years of limited resources and minimal media coverage, the sense was that the league was now more interested in its public narrative than in addressing the structural failings they had observed firsthand. The 2024-2025 Los Angeles Lakers offered an instructive parallel that several analysts raised when discussing the WNBA's situation. The Lakers finished that season with a 50-32 record, a respectable figure by conventional measures. By advanced metrics, however, the picture was less favorable. The team sustained 11 double-digit losses, carried one of the worst average margins of defeat in the league at nearly 19 points per loss, and posted a negative point differential despite a winning record. The divergence between headline performance and underlying metrics was seen as analogous to the WNBA's position, surface indicators suggesting health, while more granular data pointed toward fragility. Both cases represented situations in which brand recognition had outpaced product quality, creating an environment where financial and emotional expectations exceeded what the actual output could sustain. Looking ahead to 2026, the league faced a set of decisions with significant long-term implications. The planned expansion into new markets, including Golden State and Toronto, increased geographic reach but also put additional pressure on an already strained officiating core and stretched the available talent pool at a moment when the quality of play was already a subject of criticism. Adding franchises while existing structural problems remained unaddressed carried the risk of amplifying those problems rather than resolving them. New markets might generate initial interest, but if the product on the court did not meet the standard implied by current ticket prices and valuations, expansion could accelerate the credibility problems the league was already working to contain. The 2026 collective bargaining agreement negotiations represented an equally significant juncture. Players were positioned to demand a larger share of the revenue their performances had helped generate, including percentages of television rights and merchandise sales. The league, still operating with the memory of a $40 million annual loss, faced the prospect of resisting those demands in ways that could produce labor unrest. A strike or lockout during a period of peak public interest would carry consequences difficult to quantify in advance but easy to predict in general terms. An interruption in momentum at the precise moment when the league had the most to gain from sustained, uninterrupted growth. The negotiation would also need to address conditions beyond salary, travel arrangements, training facilities, medical staffing, and post-career support, areas in which the WNBA had historically lagged behind what a league commanding nine-figure television deals would be expected to provide. The global landscape of women's professional basketball further complicated the WNBA's position. European and Asian leagues had increased their investment in women's basketball, and while the WNBA remained the most prominent destination for international talent, The margin of advantage in compensation and conditions was narrowing. Retaining that competitive position required the league to act on multiple fronts simultaneously: improve officiating standards, stabilize compensation structures, invest in player welfare, and ensure that the quality of play justified the prices fans were being asked to pay. The mental and emotional demands on players during this period also warranted attention from league leadership. The 2024 to 2026 window brought an unprecedented volume of public scrutiny to WNBA athletes, not only regarding their performance but their personal lives, associations, and public statements. Social media provided a platform for reach and connection, but also an unfiltered channel for hostility. Players spoke publicly about the toll of operating at the center of a highly polarized cultural moment. The league's capacity to provide mental health resources, media training, and a stable professional environment was directly relevant to the health of the product on the court. Athletes who were psychologically worn down or physically overtaxed were more likely to sustain injuries and less likely to perform at levels that justified premium pricing. The league could not treat player welfare as secondary to commercial considerations and expect those considerations to remain favorable. The synthesis of the 2024 to 2026 period revealed a league that had experienced genuine, historically significant growth and had simultaneously exposed deep structural vulnerabilities that growth alone could not resolve. The Indiana Fever's trajectory illustrated both dimensions of this dynamic. The franchise had become, in a matter of months, one of the most commercially significant properties in women's professional sports. It had also become the focal point for criticism about coaching decisions, roster construction, injury management, ticket pricing, and officiating failures. Those criticisms were not trivial complaints from a disgruntled fringe. They reflected substantive problems that, if unaddressed, carried the capacity to erode the commercial gains the league had made. The path forward required decisions that were in some ways in tension with each other. Ticket prices high enough to reflect commercial demand but calibrated to retain the local fans who provided consistent, non-celebrity dependent attendance. Expansion aggressive enough to build geographic breadth but paced to avoid diluting the talent pool and officiating quality. Compensation structures responsive to the revenue players had generated, but sustainable within a business model that had only recently moved toward profitability. Labor relations collaborative enough to avoid a damaging work stoppage during a period of peak visibility. None of those challenges was unprecedented in professional sports, and none was insurmountable, but each required the kind of deliberate long-term institutional planning that had not always characterized the league's management. The Caitlin Clark effect had created conditions, elevated valuations, expanded media coverage, record attendance figures, that gave the league's leadership more tools and more leverage than at any prior point in the WNBA's history. Whether that leverage would be used to build durable institutional infrastructure or would be consumed by the immediate pressures of managing rapid, uneven growth remained the defining question of the league's next phase. The record is clear on what the 2024 to 2026 period produced. The record is less clear on what it will ultimately mean. That determination will depend on decisions not yet made, negotiations not yet concluded, and a willingness to treat the league's structural challenges with the same seriousness that has been applied to its commercial opportunities.